and taste. Sweet. Sour. So good to taste.
Welcome to Great Taste on KICI 105.3 FM in Iowa City, or maybe you happen to be watching this if we did end up getting it up on video. Anyway, whatever your situation is, I'm Steve Boss, and glad to have you with us. 60 minutes of delicious radio, or for maybe delicious video, we'll see. Francis Thicke is my guest on this show, and Francis and his wife are the owners of Radiance Dairy in Fairfield, Iowa. And Francis served 5 years on the National Organic Standards Board, so he's a perfect person to talk to about the organic movement and what's happening. And he's also a great person to talk to about the dairy industry. And we're going to try to drill down and get some insights into what's going on in the small farm area of our agricultural landscape. Francis, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve.
So I just wanted to ask you if you just try to get a little bit closer to your mic if you can. Yeah, that's good. If it's comfortable for you, that's all. Otherwise, we'll be fine.
I'll do it.
All right. So I think, why don't we just start at home in a sense, with Radiance Dairy. How long has Radiance Dairy been around? How many cows do you have? And just talk a little bit about your operation. And I just want to make sure everyone understands that this is an organic dairy operation.
Well, Susan and I took over Radiance Dairy in 1992, so almost 30 years. But Radiance Dairy began in 1980, 40 years ago. And it started out as a little co-op where people owned part of the cow and they had raw milk. And then in about 1987, the state required them to put in a pasteurizing system. So when we took it over, there were about 22 cows. Now we milk about 80 cows. So we've expanded incrementally over the years as our market has expanded and as we've increased the diversity of our products.
So you have not only milk, but you do yogurt, you do jack cheese, you do what else? I know I'm not going to mention the last thing yet, but the newest thing. But did I miss anything there? Cream, of course.
We do some ricotta cheese also, and paneer.
Oh, that's right.
And in the summertime, we make a liquid soft serve that is used in the ice cream machine. Although this year we're not doing that because of the pandemic situation.
Right. So, and your latest product is a fresh mozzarella, right?
That's right.
And that is just superb. It's great to use on pizzas. Really, really nice. And it's so different than the commercial type mozzarella that's available to most people. And interestingly enough, and I'd love for you to take us inside a little bit into not only the operation, but what is the reason behind, for example, right now, your mozzarella. I sent a picture of it to some people and they went, "What's that?" And I said, "It's fresh mozzarella." And they said, "But it's yellow," So I'd love for you to explain what this is all about when you're talking about fresh organic cheese.
Well, first of all, I'd like to tell your audience that if Steve Boss likes our cheese, I feel like we've been successful because I know Steve is very fussy. Just before the show started, I mentioned some food and he he made a comment, not our food, but no, seriously, that's important to me because as we were trying to formulate our fresh mozzarella, we would keep taking it up to Steve and have him taste it. And so we feel like we're on the right track, but we're still learning, like how much salt to use and so on. And so it's a tricky thing, making cheese. There are so many variables that slight variations can make a difference. And so we're learning. And the thing we want to do now is because people are liking it and we're having to make more than we can make by hand, is that we're looking for a very small scale mozzarella maker that will take the curd, it will cut it, it'll stretch it, it'll make the balls all in one operation and save us a lot of work. Now they're expensive. And so we're looking into doing that. But I think that one reason people like our mozzarella is that it's unique in that if you look on the shelf in the grocery store, other mozzarellas will say they have vinegar in it, and that's to acidify it. So the curd has to get to a certain acidity in order to stretch to make the mozzarella balls. And so, but we use the culture the traditional Italian way is to let the culture sit like overnight or for a long time until it gradually brings the pH down to the right stretching pH. And so I think that's what gives it a little better flavor. And Steve mentioned about the color. And when cows are on grass, the milk has a yellow color and the cheese has a yellow color. Now, there's still some open questions. Steve and I have talked about buffalo milk, if that is actually white or yellow when buffalo are on grass. But we don't know if there actually are buffalo on grass that make that white mozzarella. So we'll have to learn that one as we go along.
Right. Well, when are you getting some water buffalo? Is that coming up or not? I'll leave that one. Anyway, would we expect as consumers to see a different look in the winter when the cows are eating silage?
Definitely in the wintertime when the cows are on stored feed, it will be white. And we've seen that before with our milk. Our milk turns white during the winter because it has to be fresh grass to give it that yellow color. It's the beta carotenes in the milk that give it that yellow color. And when you dry the hay or make silage out of it, then it changes it apparently, and you don't have that color. And the same thing is true with like our conjugated linoleic acids and omega-3 fatty acids. It only comes really when they're fresh grass. Once the grass is dried or somehow otherwise stored, you lose that quality. And so having the cows on pasture is very important. And we try to start as early as we can in the spring and extend the grazing season as long as possible into the fall.
Now, what we've heard a lot, I think, over the last few years, and you and I have talked about it too, but there seems to be, some discussion, or there has been some discussion in different products that are out there where people are talking about A1 milk and A2 milk, and what's that all about? Yeah,
there is one of the proteins in milk has two variants, and they've been labeled A1 and A2. And some research, and there hasn't really, I don't think, been any research that I know of in this country, but in New Zealand and other places, have found that milk from cows, the A2 variety is easier to digest and is healthier. And some research shows that the A1 variant in the milk has some health issues associated with it. And so we've been trying to breed, we've been breeding actually exclusively to bulls that are proven to be only A2 for the last several years. And so the amount of A2 in our herd is growing. Looking at it from the bigger picture, most milk in this country comes from Holstein cows, and they have about 30% A2 and 70% A1 milk. And so mostly it's the wrong variant. And on Jerseys, which we have, are generally naturally about half and half A1, half A2. But we can select within the breed and for animals that are exclusively A2, and they will only transmit the A2 gene. And so that's what we're doing now. And any new animals that come into our herd from our own breeding are exclusively A2. They have both sides of their genes are A2. And so we're gradually increasing. I'm thinking we're probably in the range of 70% now of our milk being A2.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what about your practices? Because we've discussed this before, but the audience may not remember, or there are probably, I'm sure, many new listeners or viewers. And so, what about the practices in terms of the humane practices of your farm in particular? And are there any regulations as far as organic farms are concerned in the United States that apply to those types of practices?
The only laws I know of are the organic regulations, and they require that cows have to be getting at least 30% of their feed intake from grass during the grazing season, which is very minimal. We get like 80 to 90% sometimes, or 75% of the feed the cows have from grass. And so and some, as you know, Steve, some of the large dairies that are certified organic, it's pretty obvious that they're not making even a 30%, only they're making it on paper. And so that's one of the issues of organic these days. But that's really the only regulation. Now, interestingly, when you ask about regulation, the organic standards, embody the regulations, and the organic community worked for about 10 years to put together some animal welfare standards, which included other things besides just grazing. And they were all ready to go, and then when the new administration came in, they were on the last phase of being implemented, and that new administration threw them out. And so now we don't have the animal welfare standards in place and for organic. And there has been some effort to try to get them revised, and we may get something, it may be changed, but the industry doesn't really care for it, because we know with those regulations, if they came into place, about 70% of the organic eggs on the shelf would not qualify for organic, because those animal welfare standards require chickens to have access to the outdoors. And most of the organic eggs you see on the shelf are from chickens that are really confined. There may be a little door somewhere, but the chickens haven't quite found it yet.
Right. And I don't know how many people are familiar and have the opportunity to get what we'd call real organic eggs or real pastured eggs, and it's a little bit out of our scope of discussion here, but trust me, there's a huge difference. And if you get the opportunity, you might want to check it out, because it'll be pretty difficult, if not impossible, to go back to eating regular eggs, whether they're organic or not, again. And we can move on from there. But anyway, I couldn't resist that little bit to put in there. So Francis, can you give us a little peek into the state of the dairy industry? So many pieces of information come up that I see and have come up over the years, just the regular conventional industry, but also the organic industry, and what's the state of it right now, and what do you see as we move forward?
Well, I think it's been pretty shaky, both conventional and organic, for family farmers. There's been a move, I think, to increase the number of confinement operations, the large scale, we call them CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. And so both in conventional agriculture and in organic, that's been happening. Unfortunately, the organic standards aren't keeping them out. They should. There are two things. One is the grazing rule would help to implement that, to really enforce the grazing rule. That would help, because once you get too many animals confined, they can't walk far enough to graze and meet the grazing rule. The other thing is that there's also been a loophole it's called the origin of livestock rule. And that is that these big organic, quote, organic dairies have been bringing cows in from the conventional world and converting them 1 year. They'll buy them like 1 year before they're ready to have their first calf and produce milk. They'll buy them from the conventional farm because there is some little loophole in there that you can convert a cow in 1 year. And that loophole's been tried to be shored up so that every cow has to be raised organically from the beginning of its life, even from in the womb. And so we've been trying for years to close that loophole. Of course, the industry does not want to close that loophole. And so we were very close, and now it looks like there's another strong effort. We may get it closed here soon. But it's like, the proverbial closing the door after the barn door after the horse has left, because now we've gotten all these animals been brought in from the conventional world and brought into these large confinement organic dairy farms. And so, and they are pushing out the small scale farmers, because the price of organic milk was pretty good and stable for a long time. And then there got to be a surplus. And really at one point, like 6 big dairies in Texas, and probably still today, were producing more organic milk than all the organic dairy farms in Wisconsin combined. And so these big dairies can easily push out and they destroy the price. And then the thing is that usually these big dairies have capital backing. And so if the price goes down and stays down for a while, then it comes up, they can weather that. Whereas the small family farmers, if it gets to be too long, they can't make it. They don't have enough capital to continue on. So we've been seeing an erosion of family farmers and a growth of these confinement farms, both in organic and in conventional agriculture.
So is the answer, I mean, obviously it's much more complicated than I'm going to make it, but is the answer partially education on the consumer level as to exactly what it is that they're buying? And in addition to that, there needs to be I think a growth of regulation, more regulation or tougher regulation, but that's something that probably has to do with politics more than anything else. So right now, do we have more control over the educational aspect?
Yes, definitely. That could make a difference. It could make all the difference. You're probably familiar with Cornucopia Institute, right, Steve?
Hmm.
And what they have done, and people may be interested in looking on their website, they have rated organic dairy farms. They sent out a questionnaire, and they rated them 1 through 5 cows, like 1 through 5 stars. And so you can go online and see which dairies actually make a high rating. And that means having to do with grazing and humane practices and so on. And so that's one thing that consumers can do to check that out and to make a difference, you know. And another thing is the Real Organic Project, which maybe we can talk about at some point along here, is an add-on organic certification that brings the organic standards back to the original intent of the Organic Foods Production Act, which created the organic standards. And so what it does, this allows hydroponics. It doesn't allow, it requires grazing for cows, dairy cows, and ruminant animals all around. And it requires chickens to have access to the outdoors, and the animal welfare standards are in place, and a few other things, the origin of livestock. And so this Real Organic Project label is an add-on. Any organic farmer who wants to get this has to first be certified by USDA. And then they can get this add-on label, which means they are now, their product is in line with the original organic standards. And so it's just beginning, but we have nearly 600 farmers signed up already and certified with the Real Organic Project. So it's very exciting. It's going very quickly because not only farmers, but consumers want to know, when farmers want to produce a good product and get credit for producing a good product. And consumers want to be able to find that. If you go in the grocery store now and look for a tomato or blueberry, probably it's hydroponic. It's not going to say it anywhere. It'll say organic, but it's not going to tell you it's hydroponic. And so if you had the Real Organic Project sticker on it, it would be, you would know that it was grown in the soil. The same thing with dairy products. If it had the Real Organic sticker on it, we actually have a higher standard than NOP, the National Organic Program. We have a 40% of the dry matter requirement for dairy cows from grass. And so you would know then that this food is produced at a higher standard, at the original intent of the Organic Foods Production Act. Because, you know, organic was started by organic farmers years ago. I started farming organically in 1975. And it was really a philosophical thing to produce food in a certain way to build the soil. And it's gotten derailed. And it's understandable why, because now organic food is a $50 billion a year industry. And so you know that the big food industry is going to want to have a part of it. Problem is they want the whole pie. They don't want just a slice. And so we have to do what we have to do in order to preserve the integrity of the organic program. And things like the Cornucopia Institute and the Real Organic Project are working to do just that.
Let's just step back a minute, just so we make sure that everybody is, following us. So I think it is very confusing for consumers when they walk into a store and they see all these different labels on products, and so there's the USDA has organic standards, and if you apply and are whatever accepted, then you can use the USDA organic logo on your product. So that's one thing we're talking about. There are all kinds of other options, such as non-genetically modified, non-GMO project. I think there might be some kind of humane animal certification. There's all kinds of standards. What you're talking about with the Real Organic Project is an extension, essentially, of the National Organic Standards Board's regulations, if I understand you correctly. And not only an extension, but a firming up to go back to the original vision. And so this will then be an additional logo that consumers will find on these products. Is that right?
That's right. And just one thing to mention, a couple of things. One is that non-GMO, people sometimes think, well, that's better than organic, but they have to recognize that organic does not allow GMOs. And so it's already embodied in organic. And so, and the Real Organic Project, as you said, is an add-on, but we are including other things like the humane standard. We have also humane standards, and we're working on fair labor standards. And so the idea is that we need to embody all these in one place. And so I know it's confusing out there with all these different labels. And some of these labels are really just for marketing. Like Monsanto talks about their sustainable agriculture. We have some companies talking about regenerative. They're doing some little thing and they're going to call it regenerative now, but they're doing it for marketing. We think that real organic farming is regenerative. And so one of the things the Real Organic Project does, it makes sure we enforce the soil standards, because they're quite rigorous, but they're kind of, because there's so many ways to do things, like cover crops and rotations and all these different ways of doing things, that you can't be too specific. You have to talk about building the soil and the principles, and you can't prescribe too many exact practices. So anyway, that's kind of where we're headed.
Well, can you give us
I'm involved with the Real Organic Project myself, so I'm on the board, standards board. Go
ahead. Can you give us a little bit of a insight? We'll call it soil 55 and a half instead of 101, because that might be a little too much detail. But I know that you have a PhD, probably. Isn't a PhD in soil science?
Soil fertility, yes.
Soil fertility, right. So can you, without bringing the PhD part into it, help us all out to understand why there's such a focus on, you mentioned, for example, that in the organic standards that the Real Organic Project is formulating, hydroponics, for example, isn't allowed. So water culture for a growth medium is not part of that. So what is it about soil that people feel is critical to developing not only a product that's good for people to consume, but also for maintaining the proper balance in the earth itself?
Well, when we talk about soil, we talk about a healthy soil. And so when we talk about regenerating our soils, we're talking about rebuilding them to a healthy state. For example, here in Iowa, since we started farming, we've lost half our topsoil to erosion, and we've lost about 60% of that organic carbon to oxidation. So we've been deficit spending our ecological capital over the years. And the thing is that organic matter makes soil. When the glacier left here in Iowa, there was no soil. It was just a pile of rocks and dirt, and loose material. And only as plants and animals colonized that with roots and so on, they put organic matter in it. They actually created soil. And so then we had, and nature's ecology created some of the best soils in the world. And it's that natural ecological process that generates soil. And so if we look at that process, we can mimic those processes in our farming, and we can regenerate our soils. And basically, it comes down to increasing the soil organic matter. And that requires cover crops, it requires diversity in the landscape, and animals help if you can have animals on the landscape, because they add a lot. And so, and see, if you look around Iowa now, if you drive around, well, not now, but let's say from November until March, when you drive around, you see all the fields are bare. There aren't any crops growing. Very, very few cover crops. And so you're starving the soil then. The soil is a living thing, and it needs to be fed. And when plants are growing, they're constantly exuding sugars into the soil. That's not well known, but when the plant photosynthesizes, it takes that sun energy and makes liquid sugars, and then it makes some of those into growing its own physical body and roots. But also, it shoots about 30% or more. It exudes into the soil, and the bacteria eat that, and they then help build soil organic matter. They aggregate the soil, and so that is the whole process. So most of our farming today is really not regenerative; it's really degenerative. And so the organic standards really imbibe all these principles of how to build soil. They're in there, but they're just ignored a little bit by a lot of farmers, organic farmers, because they're not always enforced very well, just like the grazing standards aren't enforced. And then now we come with hydroponics, and the soil's gone.
So with the Real Organic Project, when do you think people will be able to start finding this type of label on products?
I wish I had my label here. We actually now have a label, and we're going to start putting it on our fresh mozzarella here real soon, as soon as we can get our label maker to do it. And so that we're going to start there. And it's going to be coming. You know, it's going to take a while. We have some things in the works, so that might be pretty exciting and make it move very fast, which I can't talk about yet.
I was just going to say, so when do we get to find out about those? So it's a subsequent conversation, huh?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I hope that you'll share it with us as soon as possible. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Okay.
So what do you see? I mean, how do you look at the future of, let's just talk about the dairy industry, the small family farm in the United States right now? What's your outlook?
It's a little difficult for the small farms all across the board, and the small dairies too. And even some of the dairy farms that were processing milk on the farm, some of them lost their market. In our case, we're selling to about 5 grocery store kind of things, retail outlets, and about 20 restaurants. Well, with the pandemic, basically all the restaurants shut down. They're starting to reopen in one way or another. So that cut off a lot of our business. But fortunately, in our case, the local stores, grocery stores, expanded their demand. So we're coming out okay. But there are some people who have done really well with this local food kind of a thing happening. Others have, stumbled a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what it's going to take is a greater awareness by consumers, and that's happening. Is people are becoming more aware of the food situation and looking for local foods. But it always comes down to the consumer, because as you mentioned earlier, you were asking about regulation. We really we haven't gotten very far with regulation. 30 years ago, I worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture on water quality. And it's funny to talk about it because back then we had a national initiative in fixing our water quality problems. And the idea was with USDA that it's going to be all voluntary because we think we can fix it in 5 years and then we don't have to have any regulations. Well, it's gotten worse over 30 years and we haven't fixed it, and there haven't been any regulations that have done squat. And so we really can't look to regulation to fix our problems. I think we're going to have to look to 2 things. One is that consumers buy, they have all the control in the world, but we have to work as an aggregate. And farmers getting on board. More and more farmers are getting on to regenerative farming. And farmers could work together, band together to market and so on, because farmers are getting ripped off. The markets in agriculture are owned by the Cargills and the ADMs and the big corporations. And they always keep the prices just so that farmers are barely hanging on or losing a little. And so they're never going to be a decent price for farmers. If farmers would band together, they could do it. Now, what's really interesting is in Canada, the farmers got together, the dairy farmers, and they created a quota system years ago. And what it's done is that farmers can only produce, they have a national quota, and farmers get a quota and they can only produce so much milk. If they produce over that, they get a very low price. And so what it's done is over the years, it's maintained the small dairy farms, conventional and organic. And so they have a lot more small farmers there that have been able to be maintained. Now, what's really ironic is that when the prices were crashed here a year ago or so, the federal administration said, well, Canada, they need to buy more of our milk. And they're trying to force it. They force it to some extent. The idea was that they wanted to crash Canada's well-crafted marketing system and dump our milk there. But keep in mind that Canada has only 30% of the population of the U.S. and 30% of the milk they consume. And so we could easily dump 10% of our milk there and kill their market and not really help us because we're going to still produce too much. But our farmers don't have any discipline to be able to work together and hold and create and control their markets. They'd rather be independent and go broke than work together. That's just the way it is. It's the American way.
It seems so strange because it seems like if you could show someone that there was an economic model that would work for them to provide for their family a good living and also make great products, you would think that people would get on board.
Well, for one thing, there's a strong libertarian streak in the farmers across the country, in this state, and they don't want to have the government telling them anything. They'll take the subsidies. I know a few years ago what was funny is that there was an effort to try to tie subsidies to to some better farming practices. And the farmers were saying, the main farm organization, we need the government off our back. Just let us do what we need to do, but we'll take the money.
Yeah, it's a little bit of speaking out of both sides of your mouth. Matter of fact, not a little bit; it's a lot of that. Right? Yeah, and I think that people also, one of the things that the public probably doesn't understand is that these subsidies make prices that work for these large conglomerates, but don't work for the local farmer. So they keep the prices artificially low because of the subsidies that are being paid out to those companies. And the small farmer, I would think it's still the same, but you can correct me. Somebody like you, there aren't any programs that are going to subsidize what you do, are there?
The main subsidy these days is crop insurance, and I don't subscribe to crop insurance. I could get a big subsidy for crop insurance, but for me, diversity on the farm is crop insurance. I mean, if you only grow corn and soybeans and they kind of grow the same, if something happens and you have a huge problem, your whole farm is wiped out. Whereas we have the animals, we have the pastures, which are very resilient. We have a whole range of crops. We do some corn and soybeans. We do wheat and oats and barley and a whole range of other crops. And so if one crop doesn't do well, other crops will do okay. So diversity is kind of a built-in crop insurance that we use. One thing I wanted to mention on this whole thing about the large corporations, especially the vertically integrated ones, and this applies more to like the meat industry. If like Smithfield Farms owns hogs from birth until the grocery store shelf, that's vertically integrated. And what they can do then is that they can segment the profits from each, of growing the pig, of processing the pig, of marketing the pig. They can segment the profits wherever they want. And so they can segment a low profit for growing the hog. And that means that the family farmers who are in that market for growing the hog, they can't make a living because it's artificially controlled by the corporations that are vertically integrated. And then if they're also horizontally integrated, they have not only hogs, but also beef and poultry. And then when let's say the hog market crashes and they're not making any profit, well, they have beef and poultry. They can make profit over here, and they can actually try to force the hog market down as long as possible because they can make money horizontally over here. And then when the hog market comes back, they will monopolize it more. They will have more control. Each time they do that with any segment, they gain a bigger part of the control, a bigger part of monopoly. And economists tell us that when in a market like hog processing is controlled, when more than 40% is controlled by 4 or fewer companies, it acts like a monopoly. They work together as a monopoly. Well, most of the agricultural markets are way more than 40%, like 60 or 80% owned by a few companies. And so they're really monopolies. And the family farmer is kind of hung out to dry on this whole situation. So, there are what I'm trying to think of the right word for, antitrust laws that are supposed to break up these monopolies, but they haven't been enforced. And it's interesting, when the Obama administration came in 2008, there was a big effort to try to enforce the antitrust, to break up monopolies. And they held hearings all around the country, and about 6 of them. I went to one of them, and they had all the farmers testifying and the corporations testifying. And by the time the 6th hearing came around, they just kind of quietly receded and dropped everything, and we never heard another peep out of them. And so they got so much pressure, obviously, from the industry that they couldn't stand up to it. Eric Holder, the Attorney General, was at these hearings, and there were a lot of hoopla at first, and pretty soon they just kind of whimpered away with the tail between their legs because they couldn't stand up to the corporations.
Well, what I hear from this discussion is the real key still is the individual consumer. The individual consumer votes with their dollars wherever they happen to spend them, whether it's in grocery or whether it's in clothing or whatever they choose to spend their money on. And so the more we can educate the individual consumer, the more opportunity we have to create models that can work to provide people not only with a more healthy food system, but also help the environment become, or we'll say, recover and continue to recover from the abuse that it's taken for so many years since the advent of commercial agriculture. So I think that what I wanted to contribute and just throw out to you is that most consumers don't understand their power. I think that that's fair to say. I think that you talk about organizing the farmers, and I think that's great. But I think that even though there are organizations that try to organize the consumers, I think that there's still more definite need to continue to educate, help people understand what the situation is and what their opportunities are when they support local farmers who are trying to make a great product and be stewards of the land. Now, in addition to that, I'm kind of on a soapbox now, but in addition to that, I think that it's important to look back at previous models. We had the co-op model where lots of co-ops started as an alternative place to shop than conventional grocery stores. And of course, that had its heyday, and now it's under a lot of pressure in terms of the newer generation doesn't seem to be buying into that model as much. And of course, conventional grocery has huge organics or natural food sections. And so it's just easier to get all your stuff in one place. And you have Walmart now with organic foods, which of course people don't realize is contributing to keeping the pricing very low, which is great for consumers, but not great for the ideals, we'll say, of organic agriculture. So that's something that,
in the long run, it's not great for consumers, right? Because
right, exactly.
If it's going too far, we no longer have organic food.
Right, exactly. And so what we can look at, I think there are some other models that are, I think they're gaining in popularity and strength, but you can tell me because I think that we have seen over the last 20 or 30 years, more young people getting back into farming. Now, of course, it's not huge numbers, but we've seen more young people getting back into farming as the farming demographic, the owners of the farm, as that demographic ages, we have to have that. And those young people, I know a young man whose parents are farmers, and I'd like to think this is a good example, but I don't know. He said, and not to be too crass, but he said, yeah, I'm just waiting for my folks to die so I can change this farm into an organic farm. So okay, we'll move on from there. But I think that's one aspect, okay, of where change can and will probably take place. Another aspect is communities, the people in communities understanding that if they control the economic dollars in that community, they have tremendous power. So, for example, in our small community, we have a lot of money that's recirculating because people are buying local products. They're buying stuff, products from Radiance Dairy. They're buying products from other people who make local food products. They're supporting the farmers market. They're supporting CSAs. All this is real power, real economic power. And it's every dollar that's spent in those models is another dollar that's not being spent to continue the multinational control, essentially, of our food supply. So I think this is important, and I've been reading a lot lately, and I don't have any illusions that I know much about what I'm talking about. But I know in the early days of the civil rights movement, one of the more fascinating aspects that was going on was the understanding among certain communities that they needed to start their own farms. They needed to encourage people in those communities to buy food from those farms and not support the existing establishment food structure. And I think that that's continuing to go on now. There maybe is even a resurgence in that. And I think that it's continuing, it's also expanding in other areas. And this is all part of the education process, because if people realize, once they realize, I'm going to say, how much power they really have in terms of their economic the dollars that they spend, then that's going to make the change, because these large companies, they have to get, their income is their energy. The money that people spend on their product is the energy they run on. So either they're going to have to be forced to change how they go about doing things. And you know as well as I do that the way they've been forced so far is by essentially going over the last 20 and 30 years, buying up all the small organic companies so that they controlled them. and they say, oh, this segment's growing, we'll just buy it. So that way we're covered both ways. And then you've got, I think people don't even understand this, you've got UNFI, which is the largest natural foods product distributor, who bought a couple of years ago, they bought one of the largest conventional food distributors. So now they're one of the largest natural and organic food distributors and one of the largest conventional food distributors. Now, come on, how does that work? I mean, how does that make any sense? So as consumers, I think that our mission, the way I see it, is to just continue to focus our dollars on supporting local farmers, local food products, and the people that are actually making those products, and educating other consumers about that, because it's that grassroots effort. I think that's the only way, that broadening of awareness from the grassroots, that's going to actually make a profound change. And I think that it'll happen. It's just going to take time. That's all.
Yeah, it's kind of like voting. People say, well, why should I bother to vote? Because, I'm just one vote. And it's kind of, I think people have the same attitude about food. I'm just, it's just one carrot, it's not going to change the world. But it does. It's actually more than voting. Either you win or you lose in voting. But here, every actually increment makes a difference.
Right.
So consumers have a lot of power, but also consumer groups. And I'm reminded now about, remember the bovine growth hormone, RBST. That was a big thing, and it was in all the conventional milk at first. And then all of a sudden it disappeared. Some consumer groups, I don't even remember which group did it. They put a lot of pressure on the grocery stores, and the grocery stores said, okay, we're not going to take that milk. They went to the processors and said, we're not going to take any milk from cows treated with RBST. And then the processors told the farmers, okay, you got to sign an affidavit that you're not using RBST. And the thing is, there wasn't any big news release about this, that now when milk has no RBST in it, it just happened real subtly. And but that was tremendous. I was surprised. It's a tremendous thing, the change. And now even like the conventional milk here in Iowa, two big Anderson Erickson and Roberts Dairy are two big conventional dairies, and I've called them both, and they do not take. They say they do not take milk from cows treated with RBST. So that's a tremendous change very easily. But that reminds me of something. I won't mention the names here, but marketing sometimes can really try to confuse people. There is a dairy in Iowa that processes on the farm, and they market their milk as no added hormones. And they even on public radio, they've advertised it that way. And it's like, come on. I mean, for one thing, even the conventional milk does not use, treat their cows with hormones. And nobody adds hormones to the milk anyway. And you couldn't find it. And so that's a marketing tool for somebody. And it's a bogus thing.
Right.
But people, it's advertised on public radio, and it's in the natural food stores, and I think people are suckered into this thing, and it
Yes.
means nothing. It's
Right.
really a confinement dairy. The cows are confined, no grazing, and they're eating GMO foods, probably feeds, and so, but they have no added hormones.
Right. Yeah, it is, and that's it. Look, it's all still part of that educational process.
Yes.
Labels. There, I noticed that marketing in the non-GMO segment is specifically because you've got, I don't know, a zillion products out there that now have the non-GMO label, but those ingredients have never been genetically modified. Why in the world? And it's simply because, but consumers are looking for this label. We'll buy it. We'll spend whatever it takes, and we'll put it on our products. And it's like, but those products aren't genetically modified. But
Right.
it speaks to exactly what you said. It's like, but again, education. We have to educate people so they can, understand that They have the power if they have the knowledge.
Yes.
Well, thank you for listening to me too. I appreciate that. I certainly got wound up for a few minutes. So that
It was good. It was good.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think is your model, the model that you have for your family farm? Is it something that is replicable? I'm sure other family farms are like that, but is it something that's replicable to, it could be used as a way to grow that industry?
Well, you know, a lot of like, for example, I think about 25% of the dairy farms, not just organic, but conventional in Wisconsin, are grazing farms. And so the model of grazing is a very sound economic model, and it's being used widely. But the part about processing on the farm, that takes the dairy farmer outside of what they usually do. And there's a whole different set of equipment, of marketing, processing. And so it's quite a stretch. And there have been a number of, we get a lot of visitors, dairy farmers who want to do on-farm processing. And I usually try to discourage them because it's more than they want to get into. And a few of them have done it. A few of them have done it and then quit. And so it's not easy. But we enjoy it because one reason we really like it, Steve, is because our customers like our product. And we feel like we're producing something that people like, and it's healthy, and it's good for them, and it's good for the community. And that's a good motivation. If I were just doing it and sending it to some black hole, I'd quit.
Right, right. And you know what, Francis, you're actually bringing up something that's we touched on earlier, but is extremely important, I think, in terms of making the type of vision of the future that we've been discussing actually work, where there is a more healthy food supply and a more healthy environment. And that is the ability, and this is also now becoming co-opted, I've noticed recently, and that is traceability. The whole idea of tracing every single ingredient in a product from start to finish. And I've noticed recently that there's some companies that make just regular conventional products that are putting on some kind of label that say, oh, you can, just put this number in when you go on the internet and it'll show, exactly where everything comes from. But it's essentially bogus, just like what you're talking about, because there's no, okay, so it came from this particular farm. You're not telling me anything about it. I don't know anything about it. You're just telling me where it came from. So go ahead.
I mentioned, for organic, we have to do that. Any ingredient in an organic product, any ingredient has to be, you have to have for your inspector, the certification certificate for that ingredient. You have to know where it came from, and all that's embedded into organic already. But it's because it's organic, not just because it's on a list somewhere. But on that point, though, the Real Organic Project is working towards that, to be able to have a QR code, or whatever you call it. I don't even know what they are. Mm-hmm. And you could, on their organic product, you could hit it and it would show the farm, the organic farm. It would not only just tell you who it is, but it would tell about the farm. And we have interviews of all the certified organic farmers. It would give an interview of the farmer and why they're doing what they're doing. So it would be authentic.
Well, I think, what it does is it makes food more real. It makes the process of eating more real. It makes it more important, which is something that I think is really clearly needed, because we have now several generations that have grown up on food that doesn't really have any substantial nurturing built into its components, because it's basically just created either in a soil that's bereft of real organic life, or it's manufactured in some laboratories and put together and thrown on a shelf. So I think that all of these things work hand in hand, because the more people know and the closer they feel to their food supply, then the more powerful they actually feel they can become. And the reason they feel more powerful is because they're actually eating something that helps contribute to their health, as opposed to something that continues to wear away. If they looked at the body and understood really that this is a machinery, right? I mean, it's a machine. And
As you're speaking, that reminds me, if we produce food in soil conventionally with the industrial model, we're wearing away the soil like that. We're actually depleting the soil. In the same way, if we eat that food, we're depleting our bodies.
right.
So it really is true that if you have a healthy soil, you produce healthy food, that produce healthy animals, a healthy food for people. But it's subtle. And so people don't get sick tomorrow, it might take a decade before they.
Right. Well, I think this is a good way to end. And one thing I want to add is I talked to this woman who's in her early 30s just last week. And let's just say that she had been a fairly wild personality for most of her life and had suffered from, one of the things that she suffered from were eating disorders too, in addition to many other things that she was involved with. And she told me this really inspiring story about herself where she said she got into, and I'm simplifying this, but she got into her early 30s and all of a sudden was struck with this realization: this body that I have to carry it around with me for however long I live. So if I live to be 80, don't I want it to be functioning as efficiently, effectively, and as wonderfully as possible? And she said that completely reordered her brain in terms of how she was thinking, because she all of a sudden got a vision as to, instead of, I'm living for now, I'm going to do whatever I want, I don't care what happens. Then she came out on the other side and realized, I got, that's fun. Great. But I got to carry this all this blood and bones and skin and organs around with me, and I want them to be happy too. And if I want them to be happy, I'm going to have to change how I go about doing things. And I was so inspired by that story. It was great.
Most people never get that far.
Well, let's hope we can keep working to help them on that journey.
That sounds like a good story to end with.
Yes. Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you. And thank you so much for what you do and all the wonderful products you make. And don't forget smoked mozzarella. That's next, right? I'm putting you on the spot. See, now this is saved. It's going to be, radio. It's probably going to be on video somewhere. Now you're in trouble. So smoked mozzarella. Just remember those two words.
We'll look into it. Thank you. And thank you for all the work you do, Steve. We really appreciate, you're a leader out there with that beacon light so we can all follow. That's
too kind, actually, but thank you. I appreciate it. You've been listening to Francis Thicke, who he and his wife are the owners of Radiance Dairy in Fairfield, Iowa, an organic dairy farm, small farm, producing wonderful products. And we've been talking about the current state of agriculture in the United States and also about a lot of other topics, including some new certification plan that's going to be coming out called what's it called again, Francis? Real Organic
Project.
Real Organic Project. And so we'll look forward to that. You've been listening to Francis, to me, and we hope that you've enjoyed it. And we'll be back with more great taste on KICI 105.3 FM. And also, if you're watching this on some other particular delivery system, we'll be back there too. 60 minutes of delicious radio or TV, whatever it is, always coming your way from Great Taste.
Great taste. Sweet. Sour. So good to taste.